Morning everyone, and welcome to this video lesson about responding to Ozymandias by Percy Shelley. So what we're going to do in this session is we're going to become familiar with a simple marking criteria, which is based on what the examiners want to see in GCSE Literature Paper 2. We're going to look at a strong example paragraph, so you can see an example of the kind of stuff they're looking for in terms of what the response should look like. And then we're going to confidently write a paragraph response to a question. The question will be phrased in the way that it will be on the actual exam paper. For this, you're going to need a copy of Ozymandias, ideally annotated. If that's a problem at all, you can always flick back to the last video about annotation. Everything you need is on that video as well, but hopefully if you're doing this video, you've probably done that video as well and annotated a copy yourself. And obviously you'll need a pen and paper or access to a Word document. So to start us off, I'm going to show you a series of skills, Englishy skills that you might find in various exams. And I just want you to pick out and write down which ones you think will get you marks in a literature exam when you're writing about poetry. So we've got spelling, we've got quoting a poem, we've got naming techniques like an adjective, we've got varying your sentence starters, referring to power or conflict, using impressive words, referring to the writer's ideas or context, impressive punctuation, analysing the poem, and answering the question. So pause the video now and have a go at that. Right. This is an interesting one here. You'll be very surprised at how many pupils I've met who still think you get marks for stuff like spelling in poetry exams, which is absolutely not the case. Please remember, when you're answering a question about poetry in an exam, they want to see what you know about the poems. They don't care about your sentence starters, your spelling, any of that kind of technical stuff that's in a writing exam. It's all about how well you analyse the poetry. So what you get marks for is obviously answering the question. It's one thing to write a lot about a poem, but you have to make sure what you're writing is relevant to the actual question they've asked you. You need to refer to power or conflict. You may not have got that initially, but remember the whole point of this poetry cluster is they're all about power and conflict. The question will always be about power and conflict, so actually the two of them are pretty similar. The question will be about power and conflict, refer to power and conflict in your answer. Pretty straightforward. Obviously you need to quote the poem. It is heartbreaking how many pupils go to an exam and then don't quote the poem, particularly when it's in front of them. It's utterly maddening. So make sure you're quoting the poem, otherwise you've got nothing to write about. Make sure you name a technique or two or three, or ideally a few more than that. So when you are talking about a quotation, state what technique it is. And the best responses tend to refer to language techniques and structural techniques, that's like listing, enjambment, caesura, and form techniques as well. It's not exhaustive, but do try and vary the techniques you refer to. The biggest thing you get marks for is analysing the poem. This is the bit where you show off your working out. This is the one bit where English is a bit like maths. In maths, you get lots of marks for showing how you've worked out an answer. In English, exactly the same skill, only you've got to say how you've worked out the answer from the quotation and use your analysis skills to demonstrate your thinking. That's all analysis is. It's demonstrating your thought process and how you've worked an answer out. We'll give an example of that shortly. And the last thing is to refer to the writer's ideas or context. Context means what's going on around the time. So in Ozymandias, that could be referring to Romanticism, Shelley, the actual Ozymandias himself. To be honest with you, I wouldn't worry too much about context. It is in the mark scheme, so I've put it in here. The thing they're really looking for is writers' ideas, particularly ideas about power and conflict in a general sense. So all the stuff that we're seeing in Ozymandias in this poem and this statue from 3,000 years ago and this poem from a couple of hundred years ago still applies today. I'm sure we could think of world leaders who rule by fear and leaders in a more sort of low-key social sense who kind of rule by fear and the impact that that has. So referring to those general ideas is where the marks are. And again, take your time with that. Ideas and analysis are absolutely key here. So let's now look at a question on this poem, and this is how it's going to be phrased in the exam itself. Explore the presentation of power in Ozymandias and one other poem from the anthology. For today, we're just going to look at Ozymandias, which is why that bit's in bold. We'll look at the comparison bit in a later video. So the first thing with this question, and with any question in any English exam, language or literature, we look at the words we need to annotate, the important words. And the important word in this is power. That's what they're asking us to do. Talk about power in Ozymandias. How is it presented? So we know how power is presented. We know it's about a leader who's quite cruel and gets his power by being cruel. And then we know that that power crumbles away like the statue, and that he's not respected or remembered because he was cruel. That's what we can say about Ozymandias. So when we're writing a response to a poetry question, or any literature question, in fact, I tend to use an acronym called PETAL. I'll talk to you about what that means very shortly. But PETAL is just a way of structuring a particular paragraph. We'll look at how we can link these paragraphs together in future videos here. But for a poetry response, I'd expect about 4 paragraphs of PETAL. Again, I'll do a later video on planning, so 2 on this poem and 2 on the other poem. So for today, I'm going to show you my example and how it links to PETAL, and then you're going to write your own one up. So let's start. The first letter of PETAL is P, and that stands for point. So point is just giving your answer in a simple form. Where is the power in Ozymandias? Well, the first thing we can see is that in Ozymandias, we see how Ozymandias' power is maintained by being cruel to his subjects. We know that. He's a cruel, nasty, mean leader, and that's what keeps his power in play. So that's our point. Now that's the answer. We've answered the question here. But obviously that's not going to get us many marks, because that is currently just an opinion. It's not backed up yet. So it's not worth a great deal by itself. But we have to start with our opinion before we get onto the stuff that really gets us the marks. So the first way we back this up and prove that this opinion is true or valid is we have to give some evidence. So we quote the text from the poem, and we need to think of a bit of the text that shows he's being cruel. So off the top of my head, I know that his face is quite cruel in the statue. I know he's got a massive statue. I know he's quite arrogant when he's using those imperative verbs to God. But I think for today, I'm going to talk about the facial expressions in his statue. So this is evident when the poem talks about his frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command. So that list of negative facial expressions tells me, and will tell the examiner if we phrase it correctly, that he's definitely cruel to his subjects because he looks mean. The face of his statue, the very face of his kingdom, is looking stern and austere and nasty, right? And that's how he gets his power. He keeps it by being mean and making people scared of him. So the T in PETAL stands for technique. Now, we can't really write a sentence about a technique by itself without really going into the A, which is analysis. The analysis is the most important part of this paragraph, and it's the most important part of the vast majority of any questions in a GCSE English exam. Analysing just means looking at that quotation and proving how it supports our argument. So how does that frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command, how does that show that he maintains his power by being cruel? We've got to kind of join the dots here and show our working out, a bit like in a maths exam. And we'll weave in the techniques as we go on, as they come up. So by listing these negative facial expressions, the poet suggests that the statue is of a completely negative, cruel leader who only shows meanness and cruelty to his followers. The use of a list emphasizes how many aspects of his face show this cruelty. So like I said in the second video about Ozymandias, that idea of a list is really useful because it just adds emphasis. If I want someone to do something and I give them a list of reasons, so you should do your homework because it improves your grades, because it makes you more dedicated, because it give all these reasons here, it emphasizes it and shows how many reasons there are. And here we've got a list of negative expressions. There's so many of them that that's all he is. He's just all negative expressions. And I might pick out another word here. The adjective cold emphasizes this, as it implies Ozymandias is cold and heartless to his subjects and only commands them rather than showing kindness or reassurance. I could talk about frown, could talk about wrinkled lip, could talk about the word command in more detail. But again, I think I've done enough here. I'm going to move on. Otherwise, I've run out of space and it would be ridiculously long here. But again, in an exam, if you see some more opportunities to analyse, please take them. And the last thing we do is we link this to the writer's ideas about power or conflict and any context that we can think of, really. I'm not too worried about context here, but I certainly know that this suggests that people with power, I've underlined that because that's the general idea, the poem is about power, again, if it's a conflict question, focus on conflict. People with power, leaders, can keep their power through being cruel to their subjects. This cruelty can create fear among the population, which makes them do the leader's bidding by being scared of them. So it's all about this idea that this is what some leaders can do. They can rule by fear and make people scared of them. If you need to stop the video to copy this down or anything, feel free, or failing that, just go back and refer to it when we're writing our own one. Now, time to write our own response. Question's the same, obviously. We're going to write up our own petal paragraph answering that question. Now, the example talks about how people can get and maintain their power by being cruel. The obvious next stage, in my opinion, is to talk about how power can be lost if you're cruel as a leader. So we know that he loses his power because of the state of the statue at the end. That boundless bare sand. It used to be a huge city, but now there's nothing there, just this trunkless statue. All right. So again, look for evidence, possibly later in the poem, where that statue isn't respected. So there's the petal structure, and there's a few sentence starters for you. If you want to refer to it, if you want to use them, you don't have to at all, but I might refer to in my point. We see how Ozymandias' power is lost after he's dead. We can talk about, again, with evidence, you might talk about boundless and bare, or nothing beside remains, that short sentence. Pick out a particular word and say how it shows that he's lost his power now, how that statue is a symbol for his power, and that if he was powerful, they'd look after his statue, but he's not, so just let it rot and decay, another good word in there. And again, talk about how this suggests that people with power may well, if they're too cruel at that point, they could end up losing it all. And that's kind of a lesson of this poem. Don't be cruel, be supportive. But either way, choose the evidence that you want to, phrase it how you would like. This is just there to help you. So pause the video now and just have a go at this paragraph. Should take you about 10 minutes or so. Okay, so hopefully you've got that paragraph sorted out now. We've got one more thing we're going to do, and this is really useful practice anytime you are you're completing a practice paragraph here, because it will just remind you of those skills. You may have to do this petal structure. You can apply to any literature text, any poem, and also some of the language skills as well in the language paper here. And that structure is always kind of the same, right? So these are the skills that you tend to need in reading exams. So making sure that we're using those skills is really important. And the way we reaffirm that and we make sure that we're definitely using them is we annotate our response. So I've actually referred back to what we picked out in the starter activity here. So those 6 skills that we have to demonstrate here are answering the question, referring to power and conflict. You'll see that's basically making a point. Quoting the poem, giving evidence. Naming the technique, analysing the poem, and referring to the writer's ideas or context is a link. Whether you use the petal structure to annotate it, absolutely fine. If you'd rather, you can use any of those 6 boxes. But that is in essence all you get marks for in literature. I don't care how you spelt Ozymandias. I mean, it would be in the question, so don't try not to misspell it. But again, you won't lose marks for that. They don't care. As long as they can understand it and these skills are there, that is all they want to see. So you can circle them in your response. You can annotate them. So like draw a line and say, there's my point. There's me referring to power conflict. There's my quotation. Or you can tick them. Entirely up to you. But have a look through your response and just annotate where you see those skills. Right, that's the end of this session. I hope that's been useful for you.